Hello and welcome to Acclime's podcast series, Advancing Vietnam, with me, Vlad Savin, as your host. In this episode, I'm discussing with Matthew Lourey, Managing Partner at Acclime Vietnam, about the regulatory and market entry requisites governing the manufacturing sector and seek to explain the practicalities of establishing and operating a production facility in Vietnam. Matthew, welcome again to our Advancing Vietnam podcast series. Good to have you here.
Great to be here as always, Vlad.
As you well know, the manufacturing sector has been the core driver for the Vietnamese economy for the past 20 years, and Vietnam is very well positioned as one of the top jurisdictions where foreign investors are seeking to expand, diversify their production facilities. I'd like to focus the discussion today in the practical market entry specifics for manufacturing businesses, and as well look at a couple of case studies as well. Before we start, and before investors start with the establishment process, one of the first steps in the market entry in their strategy is to initiate and start evaluating locations. That means industrial zone areas, export processing zone, and many others that are providing specific frameworks from a legal and commercial perspective for investors. How does this initial step take place in general, and what are the key steps that investors take when they're looking at location?
So the reason why location is really important is, as opposed to common law and international practice of start a company using any address you want and starting a company, Vietnam has a requirement that your business lines, your location is appropriate for business lines. If you're seeking to do manufacturing, again, Vietnam companies that can only undertake the activities they're licensed to do. If you're setting up a company for manufacturing, you must have a facility location suitable for the manufacturing. So, which means you can't start the company establishment process without finding land suitable for your business lines. That leads us into a number of choices where you could do private, you could do an industrial park, you can do an export zone, or the variations around that. And so that land, identifying the land, having the right land that has zoning permissions and has ability to register and conduct those activities is the key start. Without that, you can't start the company. So you must identify potential locations for infrastructure, whether you'll build, whether it's a greenfield, whether it's an existing build, infrastructure, long-term, etc., and that it will meet the investment requirements for getting a company set up. Because we have seen situations people have signed leases and they're not able to get the company established, trying to get deposits back of who's at fault, etc. It becomes very, very complicated.
Mm-hmm. And after the investors identify a location, it can be generic north of Vietnam, center of Vietnam, south Vietnam, and they are actually looking at the creating a step-by-step process for their market entry from a structure and process perspective. How do they deal, assuming that they would choose an industrial zone or a export processing zone? How do they deal and negotiate with these entities to ensure that their establishment process goes smoothly?
And it's a very good point because, again, a normal company that is not manufacturing, you do a foreign investment approval, IRC, you do a company establishment, ERC, you lodge that with DPI, with the Department of Planning and Investment, and you're lodging with those two authorities. If you're going through an industrial part or an export zone, the process is a little bit different, where the industrial zone or the export zone has the right to do the IRC application. So it's sort of a delegated authority. So your landlord is also the licensing authority to meet the requirements. So they've got pre-commitments with the government, and therefore they're not quite independent in the process. So you're negotiating a lease, conditions, investment, you're doing the structure, and they're then representing you with the authorities. So it's a conflict in some ways, but also they're not going to do something they're not able to do. So you know if they agree to it, it's an approved process. Mm-hmm. So it's a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. You do need to have an industrial zone or an export zone, industrial park that is aligned, that understands, and so that is a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. If you draft something for applications as part of your investment, that is a commitment. So you must make sure that the commitments you're making, the undertakings, is something that's in your best interest, and you're not committing to something that is not in your best interest. So to round up the answer to the question is, have external advice and review of that process because of that conflict of interest. But if you have an industrial park where someone is making commitments that you want to the authorities, that means that it's going to happen. That that industrial park can do it and can deliver, and you're not sitting and trying to deal with the authorities on something directly. Indirectly, the industrial park has done that for you.
And the main structures that we're talking about here are the industrial parks or industrial zones and the export processing zones. Can you share a bit about the differences between these two, and what type of incentives or what kind of benefits investors will get for placing their business, their facility within these structures?
So you don't have to do an industrial park or export zone or anything. You can do a private there. The issue is permissions and infrastructure and dealing with the authorities. It's a zoning. It's much harder. Can be done with what happens all the time, but it is much harder. It is considerably easier to take a zone that has those pre-approvals, that is designed for the activities, and then it's a much easier process because it's within the scope of what the authorities are encouraging. So the industrial zones are the most common, and they're generally just large clusters with infrastructure and processes in place to allow relatively easier establishment of the enterprise and compliance with industrial environmental laws and their other requirements. An export zone, sort of the main two types, you've got an export zone which is technically outside Vietnam's customs zones. So all the raw materials and products there are not within the Vietnam tax zone. They are regarded as, for customs and tax purposes, customs and VAT purposes, as being outside the territory of Vietnam. So if you're importing, processing and exporting, it means you don't have to import the products and import all the raw materials, and it makes it easier. An industrial zone itself is just a normal industrial park that is within Vietnam, but are just infrastructures. They're the main two. There are benefits. So there are tax breaks in certain industrial zones to encourage investment. So you can get 50% reductions, you can get 0% for the first period, you can get long-term, and it varies on industrial parks. You can get some high-tech parks, which are part of their relief. So depending upon where the industrial park is located, its focus on what sectors it's looking at, and anything else that was done as part of the establishment. You could get a 5-year tax break, you'd get a 50% tax reduction for a period of time, or other combinations of. So the location, part of the challenge in doing industrial park is sometimes you want to be in a cluster near similar competitors, similar providers for that raw materials and experience, etc. But that may not be the most tax efficient. And so you may be pulled to another location because of the breaks and the tax incentives. Therefore, where does that fit? The last part of that is the complication with this, with minimum global tax we've got at the moment. You do a tax incentive for an industrial park and end up paying tax somewhere else. So the global multinationals, again, it's a bit of a challenge right now in how to play that game.
And which can affect as well the historical tax breaks that some of the large investors in Vietnam got.
Oh, absolutely. Where if you've got an indefinite tax break, a significant tax break by locating in a certain zone, and you're a large multinational and now has to pay minimum global tax, it works against you. So I always say the tax incentives are a bonus, they're not the driver. And if you're making investment decisions purely on the tax implications, you've probably missed something, because you're transfer pricing your infrastructure, your transfer pricing, supply chains, your cost, your labor costs, everything else. There's so many other things in there, and the tax impact is actually a small consequence. Transfer pricing is much more important than costing process and margins than it is for manufacturing than tax breaks alone. So it's a consequential thing, but it's not the main driver, in my personal opinion. It can be critically important, but it's often overplayed.
Let's dive deep just for a second on the specific process of establishing the entity. Can you share a few details on the types of entities that generally manufacturing investors choose, if it's an LLC or a JSC, and covering one of the most common ones, the LLC, is there a difference from the IRC, ERC application that you mentioned? Is there an investment policies decision that some of these manufacturing companies need to apply for beforehand, in certain cases, before they obtain these certificates?
So for as we touched on earlier, for a company to be established, you need effectively a two-step process: foreign investment approval and then the company certificate of incorporation. So the IRC investment registration certificate is the first step, and that is applied for, and that is your business plan, that is your commitments, that is your obligations, and that is the assessment to make sure you're bringing enough capital suitable for the business operations are deemed necessary in Vietnam or appropriate, they're not doing something which is against what the government wants, and the foreign investor is being vetted. So that's the government process, step one, and step two is the certificate of incorporations. So only foreign investors need that step one. Step two is all companies have it. The last step is the all companies. So that's your general structure. So an industrial park, that first step is done by the industrial park operator. That's part of their mandate because they've got their commitments to the authorities, and it's a delegated authority to run through that to make sure that what you're applying for actually fits in what the industrial park has promised and what it's permitted to. So it's a flow through. So from those processes, that's fairly standard. The larger the project, you may need investment policy, and it may need prime ministerial approval, it may need other approvals depending upon the size and scale. So very large projects have to get approval before they start. And smaller projects, not necessarily. It depends on the size and scale. And we do see investment policy with regards to certain activities. There are certain things which are more outside industrial parks in most cases, but it's size and scale. And that has a pro and con. That the approval is an unknown timeline where the IC, ERC actually has a fixed timelines, but at the same time, it becomes a political activity. Becomes almost a chest beating announcement, a big profile, and the support that comes with that of high profile projects. So investment policy decisions can be more painful for large projects and delay the process unknown, but the ones who do it successfully are those who turn that into a marketing exercise and political, and get their home countries to wave the flag and how great it is in the investment they're putting into the country. So double-edged sword, but used to your advantage, it can be quite beneficial.
And after establishment, what are some of the key post-establishment licenses, sub-license conditions that generally manufacturing facilities need to undertake in the immediate period after establishment?
So company establishment versus manufacturing establishment, two different things. So the company establishment is relatively vanilla, where you set it up, you've got to appoint your chief accountant, register your accounting system, register your labour, do your stamp, do your tax registrations, do your VAT registrations, and they're quite procedural. And we've done a number of podcasts, the specifics behind them, and it is a relatively procedural process. More complicated is the facilities, as I call it, your environmental, your building, fire safety, your construction, if you're constructing the building, if it's not being provided as a built form by your landlord. Those things are far more complicated. The environmental, you may need environmental assessment, by the way, prior, depending on what you're doing. And if it's a greenfield, generally you need that environmental assessment as part of that process before you do your IRC. And it's often part of the IRC, depending on the industrial park. But you still need your environmental commitments, you still need your fire and safety. Fire and safety is really complicated at the moment. There was law changes recently which are very hard to comply with, not in any way which is untoward. It's simply the standards that the authorities are pushing has made it more difficult for materials and completion of that. And as a result, we do see that as an extended time period for meeting those occupancy requirements so you can start manufacturing. You've also got customs registration. So if you're exporting or importing, you're registered for customs. You do not want to miss that. I've seen some very large penalties from customs by missing a notification to the customs authorities. And you've also got to make sure your import, export and customs approvals are also registered. So there's quite a bit in that process. Some are very procedural, some are quite negotiable with the authorities about what it is to meet the requirements and how you're going to meet them, and working with the authorities. Having an agent, having people with experience is important when doing with those activities.
We've seen quite a lot of news in the media, also due to the fact that Vietnam is part of a significant large of trade agreements where they have this environmental clause listed. And Vietnam is slowly starting to adhere to some of these European, US-driven environmental actions. You look at sustainability, ESG. So Vietnam is essentially integrating quite fast within this global framework of sustainability and environmental. From a manufacturing perspective, how important do you see, from the authorities' perspective, this environmental component of the manufacturing facilities? Is it just at the surface more of a PR type of action driven, or it has substance in that sense?
The environmental and those approvals are, Vietnam still sees the checklist. The checklist has gotten much harder. They are seeking to do the better thing for the environment, and they're making sure that that sustainability is important, but they're not doing it because ESG, and they're not doing it for altruistic purposes. It is overarching government policies and specific regional policies and sector policies that is driving a checklist approach for making sure environmental requirements. What you see is the bigger pull here is that foreign investors are driving ESG. They want LEED rated buildings, they want ESG factors dealt with from the start in every step of the planning to make sure the facility, the community, all the elements work together. And that is educating the Vietnamese authorities. They're seeing best practice come in. So some of the large multinationals are coming into Vietnam because they can be ESG sustainable. They can be compliant. I mean, the sustainability, the environmental, the communities, etc. The investors are seeing how they can impact and what they can do. And if that works, then they'll tick the box and start the process. So from a point of view then of meeting the local requirements, that may be a different thing. The specific requirements for wastewater treatment from a facility may have no connection to an ESG. It may be we're going to have a certain machine, and that's our international best practice. How does that comply, and how does that discharge, and who's measuring that from a Vietnamese context? Separate process. Mm-hmm. They're both achieving similar goals, but they're being done for different reasons. But the ESG, in particularly that broad ESG concept, is really has changed the landscape of foreign investors of what they expect. And compared to some Vietnamese competitors where it's harder, Vietnam and the free trade agreements, amongst other things, has made that a functional possibility, and therefore it is, from an investment point of view, we're still seeing good flows of investment in a very soft global economy because that is an option. People can focus and get that. You can rent existing buildings that are ESG, LEED certified, that help with ESG compliance pretty quickly from upfront. Unless you've got specific needs, there actually are buildings built now. Developers are understanding, and they're building for the foreign investors, knowing that that's a core requirement in their investment process.
Including the industrial zones, industrial parks as well, that they are upgrading their processes to ensure that they can meet the requirements from the foreign investors.
Correct. And there's some greenfield. There's not a lot, I wouldn't say it's large, greenfield for large scale, but smaller facilities exist that are being built. So there are certain industrial zones that have been developed from day one with that key global ESG compliance in what investors are looking for as part of their tenants in the core foundation of starting that business. So yeah, they make it important, and they require all those coming into the industrial park to follow that approach. So it's, and a green industrial park is something. Now, how you measure that, but that's definitely the focus, what they're trying to do.
Let's go back for a second on the global minimum tax that you just mentioned before. There were quite a lot of news as well within the media about how this impacts some of the largest manufacturers here, like the Samsungs and Apple and Legos. But as well, what does this mean for the new manufacturing facilities trying to come into Vietnam? Would they be able to take advantage of these potential incentives of reductions, CIT, VAT, and others, or they will just have to align and expect that 50% minimum? And how does Vietnam play that game in the global scheme?
Yeah, and it's not a Vietnam question; it's a general question, because there's global minimum, and even though Vietnam is not party to that, it's impacted everywhere. And that was the whole overarching thing. If enough countries, the major economies, made that core part of their policy, it impacts the whole world. And that's a good thing to stop tax avoidance. Vietnam's tax base standard corporate income tax rate is 20%, above that minimum. So by default, you come to Vietnam, fine. If you get those tax incentives, and that is an issue now, and you're one of those, and remember, this is a very small number, very large percentage of the world economy, but a very small number of companies. It is the very, very large. So the Samsungs are affected, and that's 15% of Vietnam's economy, export, comes from Samsung, a significant amount. Samsung is a huge player here. It makes an impact because their investment decisions now, they've got to be careful about what they're doing, because if it's a tax-driven investment decision, that's going to be significantly altered. If it's an economic-driven decision and tax is just a consequence falling out, it probably doesn't make that much of a difference. And as I said earlier, if you're a normal investor, tax is going to be a consequence, not the driver. In my opinion, that's the better way to do it. And your transfer pricing, your production costs, and your margins and your global structuring is going to be a bit more important than the end tax. If you are not a global multinational that's affected by global minimum tax, great. It's an additional benefit. If you are, you're probably not going to care, or you're going to actively look for a new investment outside of those zones of tax breaks that are going to cause tax implications. But keep in mind, if I'm going to a normal zone with 20% tax, my global minimum is 15, if I get a tax incentive and a top up my home country, I'm probably still better off than paying the full tax, theoretically. So there may still be benefits for doing that, and it may be more complications. So I don't think it's clear, and I don't think we've solved, and I don't think the Vietnamese authorities and governments have solved what that means, and whether they do optional top-up taxes, etc., and we see less. So trying to encourage like technology, high-tech businesses with tax breaks may be something that Vietnam works away from and develops different techniques. And they've had discussions about what that might be. We haven't seen anything concrete about how that drives the investment landscape moving forward in Vietnam, so that we don't alienate those multinationals. We stay compliant with global tax, and Vietnam continues on its FTA push to be an integrated part of the world's manufacturing process.
From an investor perspective, and specifically looking at the corporate governance onshore and offshore from a group perspective, what are the best practices that you've seen for manufacturing investors when they're looking at their structure, their onshore and offshore structure, how to link them to ensure that they have tax compliance, but also general corporate governance, localized and as well international?
So let's go back. I probably didn't answer one of your earlier questions. So normal structure Vietnam, you can do JSC, but that's a 3 or more person or investor structure. Manufacturing generally not JSC. So joint stock companies are effectively a public company. LLC is the normal process, which is a limited liability company, 1 or more shareholders. The most common structure we see is an offshore parent company, regional head, quite commonly Singapore might be the regional investment head. It may be direct back to a parent country, and that will own 100% of the Vietnamese entity. So that your directions, your decisions for Vietnam is coming through, passed down through a corporate structure, and that corporate structure may have manufacturing bases in a number of countries. Vietnam's part of that. So it really comes down to how your structure is, how many manufacturing bases, where you're exporting to, what you're doing. So if you're importing, exporting, and very little local value add other than labor and rent, an export zone may work perfectly. If it's a domestic market, you don't want that at all. If you're using domestic sources, you're probably not. You just use your customs exemptions for delayed customs for import re-export. So you can do that. When it comes to the actual corporate structure side, that 100% one single member LLC manufacturing enterprise owned by either a regional headquarters or a process to make sure that you can move components between the group, particularly manufacturing sites. There's a number of ways to do it, but that's what you tend to do. What you want to be able to do is to use transfer pricing, make sure that your margins are being earned where you want to earn them, a few in different countries, and you're not going to have too high an impost in one country and too low in another. So there's no generic answer to that. It's about getting that structuring right. And you don't want to be making all your profits in Vietnam when you're selling somewhere else, or vice versa, and expose yourself to risk on either side. So that structuring, that sourcing, that distribution, where you're manufacturing, how you're manufacturing, there's no simple answer to that. And that's the reason is you need that advice, is to get that structure right, that plans for long term and doesn't trap capital, doesn't trap profit, doesn't create too high a tax rate or too low a tax rate.
Let's close the discussion with a case study. I know we had in the last few months quite a few meetings with manufacturing facilities that are present in Vietnam for 10, 20 years, and now they're looking at really understanding their corporate governance and how to make it efficient from an offshore-onshore structure perspective. What were their general choices when they're looking at restructuring their entities here in Vietnam, and what are the benefits of undertaking this process?
So the example that you're leading to was a company that exists, has multiple shareholders, set up a new company for a new location, different shareholders. there's majority foreign owned, different people. They're looking to potentially one of them to exit and do succession planning. It makes it complicated. If you're selling a Vietnamese equity in a company, you have to go through the approval process. And if you've got multiple shareholders, if there's no shareholders agreements, if there's no understanding, it becomes really, really difficult. So the most common approach is, as I said, is say a regional holding company that owns the equity in the local. The reason is Singapore is often used is that it's a common law jurisdiction. You can do you have a shareholders agreement, you can do transactions, you're not needing government approval, and that it owns 100% of Vietnam. Vietnam, when you do change the shareholders in that Singapore level, you don't need approval for the transfer of the Vietnam because there's no actual ownership transfer at the Vietnam level, it's at the Singapore level. There may still be tax considerations, but from a process-wise, it's much easier. And that way you're not trying to deal with multiple parties. So that Singapore entity could hold the equity in both of those companies, and the individuals and the various parties are covered offshore. And so that a buyer can deal with one transaction, one agreement, and not have to deal with the different approvals and different individuals and different structures. The worst thing we see is having multiple structures in Vietnam with different ownership, with handshake agreements, because then when one party wants to change, it becomes very challenging to get an agreement, to process, go to the authorities. And as you've seen in Vietnam in your time, and I've seen many times, is particularly with joint venture type arrangements, as we call them, where multiple different individuals, their dreams change, their objectives change, and what you understanding at the start as joint ventures may be very different later on, and trying to get an agreement and understanding. And if you've got a clear shareholders agreement, ideally in a singular offshore location for simplicity, but not exclusively, but if you have that, you can much more easily run the business, make decisions, internally do things without objection from different shareholders, and have an agreement that's succession planning and ability to bring in new capital, which makes it much, much easier. So that's often is that cleanup operation from a structural perspective.
And since you mentioned capital, how important it is for a manufacturing facility to really assess and look at the capital funding. How does that work in practice?
And that's where you come down to at the start, the industrial authority, the authority that owns, industrial park owner that owns that land, because part of what they have to present in your ISC application is your capital funding and how you're going to use it. And sometimes there's limitations on what you can, with your capital you have, what you can produce. And so you've got production expectations in factoring. Oh, we've got more efficient, we can produce more. You may not have sufficient capital for that industrial park for the registration to produce more. You may need to bring more money in to support it. So even though you're more efficient than your first plan and you can do 3,000 units a month instead of 2,000 units a month, they may cap you at 2,000 because of the capital in relation to your facility and for what's been approved. You may need to bring more capital to increase your production, as bizarre as that sounds. So getting the advice at the first stage so that understanding what capital and what your facilities are, what production and what's necessary and where it's coming from, debt or equity, into that initial planning will have a very important impact on your business and what you can do in your industrial facility. That doesn't apply to the same extent in a private. This is one of the things in private, you don't have those same level of commitments. You have a general commitment, but you don't have that specificity that you get in an industrial park. And that's that one of those pros and cons again.
Matthew, our time is up. Thank you again for sharing your insights on this podcast.
Fantastic. Always great to talk.
Vietnam has many advantages to attract foreign investment in manufacturing, including stable business environment, openness to new generation free trade agreements, and an abundant labor force. Additionally, preferential policies for foreign investors continue to demonstrate Vietnam's open foreign investment policy by reducing some of the administrative procedures. However, current assessments indicate that the procedures for applying for operation in manufacturing licenses are still quite complex. To legally enter the market and avoid potential problems, investors should carefully consider legal factors and seek advice from professionals, experienced consulting firms, if necessary. Thank you. And many thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in to Advancing Vietnam podcast series. For more information about this topic, please check out our publications on vietnam.acclime.com. And if you want to reach out to us for any additional details, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn or throughout the website contact details.